The whinny cut through the silence of the night like a cry of urgency. Apollo, a majestic 16-year-old bay horse, pushed hard against the gate of his stable, something he had never done before. The wood creaked, and for the first time in all these years, the latch gave way. He raised his head, his flaring nostrils breathing in the crisp autumn air, his ears keenly tuned to sounds beyond human perception. Rose Miller, the dedicated caretaker who had looked after the horses for over 3 decades, awoke suddenly in her small house near the stable. At 72, her sleep had grown light, especially when it came to the animals under her care. She slipped into her worn slippers and hurried to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched Apollo, her favorite horse, behaving in a way entirely out of character. Rose. "Apollo," she called softly, but the horse didn't even turn his head toward her. Instead, his brown eyes remained fixed on something far off in the direction of the city lights twinkling on the horizon. Rose had known Apollo since he was a foal. Through all these years, he'd always been a gentle and obedient animal, used in therapy sessions for children. His calm, intuitive nature made him perfect for working with young patients. But that night, something in his behavior was unmistakably different. Autumn had arrived early that year, bringing colder nights and a wind that carried the scent of dry leaves. Rose watched speechless as Apollo crossed the field toward the fence. Her heart pounded as she saw him leap over the low barrier with surprising agility for his age. "Rose, oh my God!" Rose exclaimed, running to pull on a coat over her nightgown. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she fumbled with the buttons, but Apollo was already too far gone. The horse moved purposefully toward the city, his hooves beating a steady rhythm on the rural road. Rose dashed to the phone and dialed the local police. "Rose, please, my horse has run off." He headed toward town. The operator tried to calm her, but Rose knew Apollo too well to be at ease. In 16 years, he had never behaved like this. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Meanwhile, Apollo galloped through the empty streets of the small town. The sound of his hooves echoed between the silent buildings. A few late-night drivers swerved, startled at the sight of a lone horse trotting with such determination. Streetlights cast long shadows of his imposing figure against the walls. The horse seemed to know exactly where he was going. His instincts, honed from years of working with sick children, guided him along a path he had never traveled before. The empty streets of the early morning made his passage easier as he drew closer and closer to the town hospital. The hospital building rose against the night sky, its windows lit like small beacons in the dark. Apollo slowed his pace as he approached, his ears flicking back and forth, picking up the quiet sounds of the medical facility, parked ambulances, the occasional movement of night shift staff, and something else, something only he seemed able to sense. On the 4th floor of the hospital, a small tragedy was on the verge of unfolding. A family waited, devastated, as doctors debated the fate of a gravely ill infant. The monitors beeped softly, marking heartbeats that grew weaker with each passing minute. The parents, exhausted from weeks of constant vigilance, had no idea that an unlikely savior was about to arrive. Apollo stopped in front of the hospital's automatic doors. His calm, determined demeanor made the security guards, initially alarmed by the sight of a horse, hesitate to chase him away. The animal waited patiently until the door slid open for a nurse who was stepping out, and then with deliberate steps, he entered the hospital. Rose, who had followed in her old car, arrived just in time to see Apollo entering the building. Her heart nearly stopped. In all her years working with horses, she had never seen anything like this. She climbed out of the car, her legs shaking as she watched the security guards and hospital staff react with a mix of astonishment and confusion at the horse's presence. "He's mine. He's a therapy horse. He's never done anything like this before." But Apollo was already inside, his hooves making soft sounds on the floor. Somehow, he seemed to know exactly where he needed to go, moving with a confidence that left everyone around him perplexed. People in the lobby stepped aside, some frightened, others mesmerized, as the majestic animal headed toward the elevators. Time seemed to freeze in that surreal moment, as a 16-year-old bay horse, driven by some inexplicable instinct, prepared to change the course of several lives on that autumn night. On the hospital's fourth floor, nurse Clara Thompson, with 30 years of experience in pediatrics, watched the monitors with weary eyes. Her worn hands gently adjusted the tubes and sensors attached to little Thomas, a 3-month-old baby bravely fighting for his life. Outside the room, the boy's parents, Arthur and Martha, waited, dreading the moment they had feared for weeks. The unusual sound of hooves in the hallway made Clara look up. Through the glass of the neonatal ICU, she saw something she could never have imagined in 3 decades on the job. A massive bay horse walking calmly down the corridor, followed by a small crowd of stunned staff and an elderly woman trying to catch up. This can't be happening," Clara murmured, but her eyes didn't deceive her. The horse stopped directly in front of Thomas's room, his ears moving gently, picking up the sounds of the medical equipment. "I'm so sorry," she said, addressing Clara and the baby's parents. "He's never done anything like this before. Apollo is a therapy horse. He's worked with children for years, but this is different." Clara noticed something remarkable. Thomas's heartbeat, which had been weak and irregular, showed a slight but noticeable improvement as Apollo drew near. The baby, who had barely moved in days, gently flexed his tiny hand. "Wait," Clara said, as 2 security guards approached to remove the horse. "Look at the monitors." Arthur and Martha, Thomas's parents, moved closer to the glass, their expressions caught between worry and awe. Martha, with tears in her eyes, watched as Apollo kept his gaze fixed on her son, his nostrils moving gently as if trying to sense something only he could detect. "He's always had a gift with sick children," Rose explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "But in 16 years of therapy, I've never seen him act like this. It's as if he knew he was needed here." Dr. Howard, the doctor in charge of Thomas's case, hurried onto the floor, alerted about the unusual situation. His 40 years in medicine had not prepared him to encounter a horse in his neonatal ICU. He opened his mouth to order the immediate removal of the animal, but Clara stopped him, gesturing to the monitors. "Doctor, Thomas's vital signs, they're different." The doctor adjusted his glasses and examined the data closely. Indeed, there was a subtle but undeniable change in the patterns they had been monitoring for weeks. Thomas, who had shown little response to treatment, was exhibiting his first signs of improvement. Dr. Howard murmured, "This is intriguing," his initial skepticism giving way to scientific curiosity. He approached Apollo, observing the animal's calm and focused demeanor. "You're telling me he's a therapy horse?" Rose nodded, briefly explaining the work Apollo did with children in treatment. "He has a natural gift for comforting young patients. Some say he can sense when someone is suffering." The medical team gathered in a corner of the corridor, discussing the extraordinary situation in hushed voices. Hospital protocol certainly didn't account for a horse in the ICU, yet Thomas's vital signs couldn't be ignored. This was the first positive change in weeks. Martha approached Apollo, her hands trembling slightly. The horse turned his head toward her, his large brown eyes conveying a serenity that brought her to tears. "Please," she whispered, "if you can help my son." Dr. Howard made an unprecedented decision. "Let's monitor this situation for a few more minutes. Clara, keep a record of any changes in the vital signs. If there's any sign of stress or decline, we'll have to remove the horse immediately." Rose stayed by Apollo's side, her wrinkled hand gently stroking the horse's neck. In all her years working with horses, she had witnessed extraordinary moments of connection between animals and humans. But this was different. It was as if Apollo had responded to a call only he could hear. Minutes turned into an hour, and the small crowd in the hallway watched in respectful silence. The monitors continued to show slight but consistent improvements in Thomas's vital signs. The baby, who had barely moved for days, now showed more reactions, his tiny fingers occasionally flexing. Arthur held Martha close, both of them crying softly as they watched their son through the glass. Apollo's presence, though completely unexpected and unexplainable, had brought the first spark of hope in weeks. The horse stood still, only his ears moving occasionally, as if he were attuned to a frequency only he could perceive. Clara continued to meticulously record each change in the vital signs, while Dr. Howard re-evaluated his years of medical experience in light of the surreal scene before him. was now face to face with something that defied rational explanation. A horse who in some way seemed to be making a difference where all conventional treatments had failed. As the night wore on, news of a horse in the neonatal ICU spread through the hospital corridors. Leonard, the night administrator, was urgently called. Upon reaching the fourth floor, his expression shifted from disbelief to concern as he saw Apollo still standing outside Thomas's room. Leonard, this goes completely against all safety and hygiene protocols. The horse must be removed immediately. Dr. Howard, you can't seriously be considering allowing this to continue. Dr. Howard, who was closely monitoring Thomas's vital signs, raised his hand to signal for silence. Dr. Howard, Leonard, I understand this is an unprecedented situation, but take a look at this. He gestured to the monitors where the numbers reflected steady improvement. Dr. Howard, in the past 30 minutes we've seen more progress than in the last 3 weeks. Clara, Doctor, his oxygen saturation is rising, and look. She pointed to Thomas, whose eyes had opened for the first time in days. Martha stifled a sob, clutching Arthur's hand across the glass. Their son was struggling to keep his eyes open, his tiny fingers moving as if reaching for something. Apollo, still motionless at his post, let out a soft whinny, almost like a whisper. Rose, who stayed close to her horse, shared her insights. Rose, over the years Apollo has worked with sick children. We've seen how his presence calms them. Veterinarians say horses have an extraordinary ability to sense emotions and the physical states of others. They can detect subtle changes that we humans just don't pick up. Leonard, I understand the emotional weight here, but we have regulations. What if something goes wrong? What if the horse is startled? We're in a neonatal ICU, for heaven's sake. Nicole, actually there is scientific documentation on the benefits of animal presence in hospital settings. Of course, it's usually dogs and cats, but this is different. Leonard, a horse is too large, too unpredictable. As if in direct response to the accusation of unpredictability, Apollo remained entirely serene, his gaze fixed on Thomas, his ears occasionally moving in response to the sounds of medical equipment. Dr. Howard gathered his team in a small circle, speaking quietly. Dr. Howard, we're faced with a tough decision. Leonard is right about the protocols, but on the other hand, we're witnessing a significant improvement in Thomas's condition. Clara, the numbers don't lie, doctor. Blood pressure is stabilizing, heart rate is stronger, oxygenation has improved. They're small changes, but they're consistent. Martha, what if you send the horse away and Thomas declines again? What if this is his only chance? The dilemma weighed heavily on everyone present. Modern medicine, with all its protocols and procedures, found itself at an impasse before something that defied conventional logic. Dr. Howard glanced at the clock. Dawn was still 3 hours away. Dr. Howard, I suggest a compromise. We'll allow the horse to stay until sunrise while we continue constant monitoring. If there's any sign of deterioration in Thomas's condition, or if the animal shows any distress, he'll be removed immediately. Leonard didn't look pleased, but reluctantly nodded. Leonard, I'll need to document this thoroughly, and I want an emergency team on standby in case anything goes wrong. Rose approached Apollo, checking for signs of stress in the way she had learned over decades of working with horses. Rose, he's completely calm. Look at his ears, his breathing, his relaxed stance. It's as if he knows exactly what he's doing. The next few hours were marked by a quiet tension. The medical team took turns monitoring both Thomas and Apollo. The baby continued to show slight but significant improvements, his eyes now open more often, and his movements, though still faint, were more frequent. Arthur, exhausted but resolute, turned to Dr. Howard and asked, "The miracle in the neonatal ICU." The doctor removes his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "This means, for you know, the decision we were going to have to make. The decision about ending Thomas's life support, which had seemed inevitable just hours ago, now hung like a distant shadow. For now, we keep observing. Thomas is showing us signs we haven't seen in weeks. The sky begins to lighten on the horizon, visible through the hospital windows. The most extraordinary night in that neonatal ICU's history was nearing its end, but no one knew exactly what the dawn would bring. Apollo remained steadfast at his post, a silent sentinel guarding a fragile life that, against all odds, seemed to be responding to his presence. The first ray of sunlight begins to warm the hospital windows. An unexpected sound breaks the silence of the neonatal ICU. Thomas begins to cry. Martha, it's the first time I've heard him cry since he got worse. Tears stream down her exhausted face. Arthur wraps his arms around her, both watching their son through the glass with a mix of hope and disbelief. Apollo, who had stood still for hours, reacts to the baby's cry. His ears perk forward, and he takes a step closer to the glass, his muzzle almost touching the transparent surface. A soft whinny escapes his throat. Clara, who had been monitoring the vitals constantly, calls Dr. Howard urgently. Clara, you need to see this. The numbers, they're all climbing. Thomas's oxygen saturation had reached levels they hadn't seen in weeks. Blood pressure was stabilizing. The heart rate, still faint, was growing more regular. Leonard returns, accompanied by 2 hospital board members. Board member 1. Dr. Howard, we understand there's been some improvement, but we can't ignore the safety protocols. The sun is rising. As agreed, the horse needs to leave now. Rose, please, just look at how calm he is. Look at how Thomas is responding. Can't we just wait a little longer? A sharp sound from the monitors interrupts the discussion. Thomas's heart rate suddenly spikes. Clara, he's agitated. The vitals are fluctuating. Apollo lets out another soft whinny. Thomas seems to respond to the sound. His tiny fingers move and his eyes open fully. Dr. Howard. Wait, look. The readings are stabilizing again. It's as if they're communicating somehow. Martha approaches the glass, pressing her hand against the cold surface. Thomas turns his head slightly toward the sound of Apollo's hooves. The intensity of the moment caused even the board members to pause. Rose, I've seen Apollo work with sick children before, but never like this. It's as if he knows exactly what Thomas needs. Dr. Howard makes a bold decision after consulting briefly with his team and the parents. He allows the ICU door to be opened slightly. Apollo stands absolutely still, his nostrils moving gently, taking in the sterile scent of the room. What happened next would remain forever etched in the memories of everyone present. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for an animal of his size, Apollo stretched his neck through the doorway. His muzzle hovered near Thomas, as if sending him a silent message of encouragement. Incredibly, the baby, as if responding to the gesture, reached out his tiny hand toward the horse. The monitors recorded each change: stronger heartbeats, steadier breathing, vital signs growing more stable. Board member 2. This defies all medical logic. Clara, it's not just wishful thinking. We have documented evidence of consistent improvement since Apollo arrived. Small changes, yes, but all positive and progressive. The room was now fully illuminated by the morning sun, casting a golden light over the extraordinary scene. Thomas, who had barely moved the night before, was visibly more active, his eyes focusing on the direction of Apollo's gentle breathing. Martha and Arthur held each other, crying quietly. The decision about ending life support, which had seemed inevitable just hours before, now felt distant. Where there had been only despair, a small but undeniable spark of hope now flickered. The knight protesting the horse's presence finally surrendered to the evidence before him. I suppose we may need to reconsider some of our protocols, he admitted softly. Sometimes medicine has to make room for the inexplicable. A week had passed since the extraordinary night when Apollo had entered the hospital in the pediatric wing, now adapted to receive a very special visitor. Thomas rested in his crib, considerably stronger. His tiny hands occasionally waved in the air as if reaching for something, and his eyes remained alert, especially whenever he heard the familiar sound of hooves in the corridor. After many meetings and heated debates, the hospital had made an unprecedented decision. Apollo was granted special permission to visit Thomas daily at specific times and under constant supervision. A designated area was set up for these encounters with strict hygiene protocols in place. Each afternoon, Rose would arrive, gently guiding Apollo with the same care she had shown throughout her years in animal-assisted therapy. The horse, always calm and focused, seemed to understand the importance of his mission. His presence in the hospital had become a source of hope not only for Thomas and his family, but also for the entire staff. The numbers don't lie, Dr. Howard explained in a meeting with his team, displaying Thomas's progress charts. His recovery has been steady since that first night. Each of Apollo's visits seems to strengthen his will to live. Clara, who continued her daily monitoring, had created a detailed record of Thomas's vital signs during Apollo's visits. "It's fascinating," she remarked, her worn hands flipping through her notes. "Oxygen saturation always improves when Apollo is nearby. His heart rate becomes more regular, stronger." Martha and Arthur, who had once spent their days in anguish at their son's bedside, now shared smiles of relief. Not only had Thomas survived, but he was also showing signs of growing strength. His cries, once so faint they were barely audible, now echoed with vigor down the corridors. "It's as if Apollo awakened something in him," Martha reflected, watching her son respond to the horse's presence, as if he gave him a reason to fight. News of the extraordinary connection between the horse and the baby spread through the medical community. Researchers began documenting the case, intrigued by the potential impact of animal-assisted therapy in critical cases. The hospital, which had initially resisted Apollo's presence, now considered expanding its animal therapy program. In her 50 years working with horses, Rose had never witnessed anything so extraordinary. "Apollo has always been special," she said, stroking the horse's neck. "But what happened here? It goes beyond anything I've ever seen. It's as if he knew exactly what Thomas needed even before we did." On Thomas's last visit before discharge, the entire hospital staff gathered to witness the moment. Now considerably stronger, the baby lifted his hands toward Apollo, who gently lowered his muzzle close to him. In that moment, there wasn't a dry eye in the corridor. "Some call it a miracle," Clara reflected, "but I prefer to think of it as love, the purest, most inexplicable love, coming from a place we don't need to fully understand to appreciate." Thomas was discharged on an autumn day, much like the one when Apollo had made his first unplanned visit to the hospital. The horse, as if sensing that his mission was complete, let out a soft whinny as the baby passed by in his parents' arms on the way home. The story of Apollo and Thomas became a legend within the hospital, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles in medicine come from the most unexpected sources. A discreet plaque was placed in the corridor where it all began, engraved with the words, "To Apollo, who taught us that love and healing can come in the most surprising forms."